So welcome everybody. I'm so excited today. We've got Stephen Johnstone with us from BPP University. And I was talking about this very subject with supervisor the other day, actually, about feedback and coachees' perspectives on their coaching relationships and how they provide feedback to their coaches as well. Stephen, I'm sure, will tell you this is part of his MSc submissions work research. It's not published yet, so you're all going to ask me for slides, not available yet, but as soon as Stephen has published his paper, which I believe is about 5 weeks, I'll be able to share those with you. So please treat the data as, well, you know, not out there if you can, because then Stephen can be able to submit his MSc okay. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you straight over.
Thanks, Nicola. And Great to see so many people here. Thank you very much for attending. And yeah, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. It's great to see people sort of joining in from different parts of the globe, and also great to see people who very much recognize and know as well in the space, but equally great to have people who I don't recognize and know and be able to sort of engage with them through dialogue now. So looking forward to this session. So thanks for the introduction, Nicola. So the work we're going to do today really is just going to really consider some of the emerging research. And I really do emphasize that a word of emergence, that it's sort of findings that are emerging out of my MSc research with Sheffield Hallam, or through Sheffield Hallam University, in coaching and mentoring, and specifically here coaching. Sorry. So broadly speaking, this is the sort of the long title. I'm going to shorten it in a moment, but this is where it started. Really, the research. I was curious from a coachee's perspective of what they notice in their coaching relationships. We know that there's been numerous sort of studies on this before in terms of peak experiences and perceptions of the relationship from a coach's perspective and coachees, but I really wanted to focus on the coachee's perspective, and also to really think about feedback as well. And how does feedback exist? So what opportunities exist? And also then, how do coachees engage in the opportunity to engage in feedback? So the first stage of this presentation, give you a bit of an overview about the research methodology, really, to give you an idea of what's behind the data or the emerging data. But the shortened version of this long-winded sort of slide that I gave you to start with is essentially the coachee as being the gatekeeper to depth. And that's really where I'm at. And I love Henrikson's sort of quote from 2016, which really asks for us to recognize the client's role as the expert in the power of choice. So already we're starting to see agency and choice coming through here from the coachee's perspective. So what's the aim of today's session? Well, to share my emergent findings, but also just to open up a new dialogue. The background, as I said, is a master's research. I have been using qualitative research methods, not purely, but inductive research methods. So rather than starting with the literature or starting with a sort of a hypothesis, then I've looked at thinking, well, what actually emerges from the data that I collect. I've used a grounded theory approach, very much from a social constructionist perspective. So looking at the meaning making in terms of the interactions that people have in social settings. And I'm being really pragmatic here. I'm trying to remember, and my supervisor tells me quite often, be pragmatic, be realistic here. This is a master's level dissertation. So really what I'm looking at is a conceptual sort of framework, guide, or perhaps even resources that can maybe inform the sector and offer into the sector. How did it start? Well, really my curiosity about feedback, which is never shared with the coach. What feedback never ever gets shared with coaches and just remains out there somewhere in the ether, but never actually landing with the coach. So that's where I started. And actually, through this inductive approach of, I suppose, akin to coaching, of not knowing where this is going to go, I've very much found that, and I'm going to hopefully, share that with you as we progress through today. So these were the research questions. As I said before, what do coachees notice in the relationships? What opportunities for feedback exist? And then how do they engage in feedback? So I had 7 participants, There was all semi-structured interviews of 1 hour. They were transcribed and recorded. As I said, I used a grounded theory approach, which takes the data, and I use line by line coding. So we start with line by line coding, and then we look to form categories out of that to arrive at then what I'll show you as the main model, if you like, and a core category, which is the gatekeeper to depth. I delayed my literature review, so I actually withheld doing any literature review until the data had been collected and the findings had been found, so as not to actually increase the level of bias in terms of my thinking on the data that was being received. As I said, line by line coding, and even to today and up till probably the next 5 weeks, I'm recursively working with that data. So who knows, it might even be there might be slight subjects to change with this, but I'm hoping not, because I need to get on with some writing. So this is just a very brief overview of what, the line by line coding could have looked like, very much starting to think about looking at each individual line and actually starting to develop codes. Those codes would then form into categories, and they would help me to build this conceptual framework of what I'm sort of sharing with you today. So really, this is just hopefully giving you a bit of background in terms of the processes that I follow before we really get into the detail. Who were the voices in the research? Well, as you would expect, the participants were the voice in the research, their interview responses, their meaning making, and their recollections of coaching. But also myself has been a voice in this research in a very social constructionist way. I can't unknow things, and I can't unexperience things. I've been a coachee, I've been a coach, been a supervisee. So what I'm very much aware of is my place and my voice within this research in terms of that social construction and meaning making with the participants. But I've got to be mindful of that. So I've engaged in what we call memoing, reflective memos in grounded theory that really sort of track all of my reflective thoughts and ideas of where I think this research is going. Because I said it's not purely inductive. At some point, I have to hypothesize and think, oh, what might I think's going on here? Something we call abduction. But it's my memos that enable me to test that. So I take my memos, I take them back into my data and check them to ensure I'm rigorously applying the grounded theory method. So that's essentially that way of validating the outcomes. But what was really interesting to me, and we'll come on to this a little bit later with feedback, was that a new voice that I hadn't imagined would come into this was the participants' new awareness. So we've got the participants' awareness and the recollection of the actual events and what they were thinking at the time. But now this is new thinking. There was real tacit awareness that was coming through in the interviews, that where people were saying, I've never thought about the relationship like that. I've never, ever even considered that. That is absolutely new thinking for me. So I, in the research, wanted to actually look at separating them. So we had the participants' views, recollections, but then this new awareness, which has been really, really valuable. And then we've got your voice. So your voice has got a bit of a dotted line around it. So your voice in here, in terms of the research, will help me to better understand, I hope, what insights, ideas, or intentions that might be coming up for you in this session. So already, who knows, there might be something that I've said that you've gone, oh, that's just made me think, actually. Jot them down, but part of the 2 breakouts that we'll have, these will be the questions that we'll ask you. What insights, ideas, and intentions are coming up for you? So these were our voices. So this is essentially the conceptual framework that I've arrived at this point. So we can see the gatekeeper to depth on the left-hand side there, which is very much seen as the core category that branches into 2 subcategories. And the first on the top is very much about knowing. It's about knowing from a coachee's perspective. And that knowing was then split into relational knowing, i.e. knowing that was very much in the relationship. So the scope of the coaching, the coach's background, their approaches that they used, and also the feedback that became available or was requested. And then the second subcategory within knowing is this self-knowing that really includes within the self of the individual, this idea of levels of comfort very much came through as very much a strong sort of topic in the conversations of the interviews, and also this concept of self, their identity, their self-efficacy as they really come into the coaching space. So these categories that are at the far right, they all sort of emerged out of the line-by-line coding. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you can see the second subcategory, and I've defined it as not knowing, but just knowing. So this idea that people intuitively will not know if they trust somebody, but they just know they can trust them. This not knowing, but just knowing. So this intuitive knowing. And what became very much apparent at the start was that trust, partnership, the coach's motivation, the coach's interest, and the coach's listening were all at the same level. But what's actually emerged in the last couple of weeks, in fact, is this very much this realization that trusting being slightly up more of a being a hierarchy, that partnership and coach's motivation, all perceived, remember, and coach's interest and the coach's listening all feed into this building of trust, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And where really the significance happens is where the not knowing, but just know, that intuitive knowing, meets the knowing at the gates of depth, enabling an individual through agency to actually decide whether or not they pass through the gates and we actually start to work at depth, or whether or not in some cases the clients talk about a functional use, a functional zone of coaching that's not working at depth, or a tick box actually has been referred to, a tick box zone of coaching. So the gatekeeper to depth. I've just shared with you here a couple of quotes that came from two participants. Just give you a moment to read those. So what we can see in the left-hand quote here is that there was this perception of not trusting, but almost this sense of agency, well, this agency coming through, that I should have walked away. I should have walked away, but the agency and choice of not choosing to walk away, despite the fact that trust wasn't there. But with coach 3, because there was trust available, there was this opening up. And on the right-hand side, really great quote here is from participant 4. We would have got there, but it was participant 4 who chose not to let them get there, because there wasn't this perception of the coach being interested and not asking questions that would suggest interest. It was felt that it was a surface level conversation. But the participant actually said, the interviewee said, we would have got there. Had they demonstrated that they were interested, I would have let them get there. I would have let them go through the gates. So this real sense of agency, this silent disengagement. There's a couple of quotes here from Sheldon on the left. Claire Sheldon, 2018, looked at intuition from the coach's perspective. But she talks there around staying put or entering the territory. And it really resonated with me when I read this and thought, is this what's happening with the coachee as well? This entering the territory through the gates, enabling that rite of passage. And Frankel and Levitt on the right is this agency may produce disengagement. So here what we're seeing is this agency to still engage functionally, but disengage in terms of enabling depth to occur. So really, hopefully just two quotes that give you some sort of indication as to what might be happening at that space. So in summary then, in terms of this what do they notice? The coachees really talked about being attracted initially to their coach through similar backgrounds, but that only lasted for so long. That can only carry on for so long. And this willingness to tolerate being uncomfortable, whether that's through they think it's okay to be challenged and feeling uncomfortable, but also this willingness to be uncomfortable when, do you know what, they know it's a surface level conversation, but they tolerate the process. They tolerate it and they remain silent, demonstrating that they are engaged. They'll always turn up to their sessions, but disengaged in terms of how they bring themselves to the session. varying degrees of awareness. The coachee said, not really aware of what agency I had in terms of the scope, being pleasantly surprised when they could talk about other things, and as opposed to things that they just didn't think were in scope of the coaching. So their role in terms of what role they played, and one particular participant very much talked about this awareness of agency in terms of their role in preparing for the sessions and being in the right place for the sessions. But also then this silent demonstration of choice. And as we saw from the quote before, this idea of disengaging, remaining in the functional space, but being very silent about that, not sharing that with anybody. And from the intuitive not knowing, but just know, this perceived trust based on the coach background is conditional. And in fact, there were some instances where trust was based on the recommendation from the person that had recommended them to be coached. And so they were trusting the recommendee as opposed to always trusting the coach. But this linking coaches' approaches to intuition. So on the right-hand side here, we can see some of the things that people started to link. So they were saying that contracting about feedback at the start of the relationship or through actually really gave them this intuitive feeling of partnership. The summarizing, good summaries in the coaching sessions, just this intuition about listening, the transparency of techniques, of why we're doing certain techniques and what we're going to be doing. Again, partnership, regular check-ins inside and outside of the sessions, really demonstrated interest and motivation on the part of the coach. That one participant said it felt like because they were regularly checking in, they weren't just kicking tires. They were there. They wanted me to succeed. They were constantly checking in, and I felt that there was a motivation for me to succeed as opposed to them just make a living. Natural feedback demonstrated this interest and partnership, and also takeaway tasks came across a lot in terms of this real sense of partnership. So what I'm doing here is hopefully trying to sort of link the two levels. We've got the levels of the coach's behavior and then intuition linking to interest, motivation, partnership. And when they come together, that's where the coachee is making sense of them. And we'll see some quotes where others in the past have thought the same. But if we go back to the left-hand side of the screen at the bottom there, this varying levels of trust, the language being used, starting to trust, building trust, losing trust, suggesting different thresholds of trust, and the fact that trust requires this interest, motivation, listening, and partnership. And that is then enabling this willingness to open up. But this willingness has agency behind it. So what was the new awareness? Well, I'm going to just give you a moment here just to read this quote. Well, it's actually a part of the transcript. Notice the links through from intuition, through to trust, through to some of the coach's approaches. This is really quite typical of some of the comments that were coming out, these real links between perception and intuition through to trusting and some of its elements, and then through to actual what were some of the coach's approaches. And just before we go into a breakout, what I want to do is share with you some of the sort of links, I suppose, little snippets of links in literature, because I hadn't considered the literature, and there were things that came up that I thought, my goodness, I had no idea that was going to come up. The whole idea about intuition didn't feature in my thoughts at the start of this research. But we've got the first one there, looking at trust and confidentially present, and this idea of letting their guard down. This management of the tension between intuitive and rational thought. So what's happening just before the gates? These sort of convergence of these two subcategories. The combination, again, more says between intuition and lived experience, and the deepening of that relationship. So we're seeing it happening in snippets of previous literature. And here we've got three more. This looking for data to confirm an intuitive account. Coming from a coach's perspective, by the way, this is the coach research, not coachee's perspective. But degrees of collaboration, but really love this quote here from O'Brien and Palmer. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I love it. It's helpful for me. It could be for many reasons that the coachee is not engaged because of their reluctance to be coached. And we also see sometimes that it's because they're not ready to be coached. Well, could it be that they just didn't trust you and intuitively they didn't want to let you through the gates? That might be the other narrative that's going on here, rather than the reluctance to be engaged. It's all very much in the favor of the coach, or this, they're not ready to be coached, I don't think. Well, there might be a different story. And Dehaan is really helpfully, along with his colleagues, saying coaches may not be in tune as they think they are. And we need to apply a more open-minded curiosity about the feelings. And what then? Now we're starting to think about, after the first breakout, we'll start thinking about feedback. And well, what does that mean for how we ask for feedback? What opportunities we provide to ask for feedback? So we have covered a lot there in 20 minutes. I suppose I don't make any apology for that, in terms of, I wanted to give you a bit of a background in terms of what's behind the research in terms of the mechanics of it and the process, and then a little bit about the findings at a very top level. Obviously can't include everything, but the first breakout is sort of a 15-minute breakout, and it really asks you in your breakout, what new insights, ideas, and intentions are emerging for you based on the first part of this session.
So what we're going to do now is just spend just a quiet minute just tapping in on the chat, things that have occurred to you whilst you've been out in your breakout rooms. And this will be really, really super helpful for each other. We can all save the chat afterwards too, but also super helpful to Stephen as well for his insight. So we'll be quiet so that you can type without having to listen. That's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, tapping in. Some things which are turning up for you inside the chat. Stephen, can you see them?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, absolutely. Trust will develop over time. Absolutely. And what we're looking at here is how people over time will look for congruence, I suppose, in terms of what some of the rational and relational sort of data is telling them in terms of the relationship or coaches' approaches, etc., or even maybe the context within which coaching has taken place. Great to see people talking about feedback already. So hold those thoughts as well, because we're going to be going on to feedback as well. But love the intention from Pernilla just around being more transparent with techniques. Pernilla, would you be happy to share just what was going on for you when you sort of came across that intention?
Sure. No, I just was intrigued about what you said about building the partnership through sharing your techniques or what's going on in the room, what you're actually doing. And so we talked about that in our breakout room quite a lot. Yeah, and I realized that I don't do that much, but some of my colleagues in the room actually are doing that. So I got new perspective on what I could actually change for the better.
Oh, thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that. And I see a couple of other comments that relate to that, so I wonder if they were in your breakout. Ewan, just seeing your comments about sensing the gates and to what extent they're open or partly open, etc. Why it's the case, absolutely, is such a complex thing, and I think that's really where I think there'll be a level of curiosity for me to sort of consider that as well. You know, what can we learn about the complexity of that? But Ewan, anything from you in terms of what was coming up for you with that?
It was just a recognition that when someone else pointed that out, everyone nodded. That the ability to feel that in your guts is probably there for a lot of us. There was a nice technique that people talk about, which was around getting someone to think about, well, what's feeling unsafe to share, and don't share that, just write that down, and then talk about why it's difficult to share that. Because we were trying to think about practical steps to try and dig into the why a bit more, because sometimes that's often it's quite challenging to explore that early on in a relationship, or even later on in a relationship.
Yeah, of course, and we will come across some practical thoughts that are coming up for me as well, so I can share those. But rather than sort of share those now, we've got the second breakout coming up as well about feedback. So it'll be interesting to see what other people come up with. But thank you for that. So Jacqueline, just talking about insights, being curious about my level of in tune. Yeah. So Jacqueline, you say much to explore around the idea of client as gatekeeper of depth. Where do you think you might explore first? Hopefully, there are. You're in the public library, Jacqueline. Okay, no problems. Feel free to pop it in the chat. Okay. So there's some comments in there around feedback as well. So hold on to those thoughts. But hopefully, it's stimulated some of those insights, ideas, and intentions. Feel free to add them to it, because really, what I want to be able to do is think, how do I position this research or the findings to best serve the popular or the community in terms of how that could be most helpful. So anything you continue to have, please feel free to share. Continuing with this theme of participant awareness and then participants' new awareness, i.e. the awareness that came out in the actual interviews themselves. So I just want to share with you some of the summary sort of thoughts in terms of what opportunities existed, but also how did the coachees engage in this feedback process. So if we start with the knowing sort of side of the category tree, various levels of perceived agency to provide feedback, the real mixed messages in terms of, am I allowed to provide feedback? When do I provide feedback? What's my role in providing feedback? So you can imagine that a practical sort of suggestion or recommendation will be about something around contracting, in terms of how we bring feedback into that conversation. They very much saw, and I didn't come across anybody who thought otherwise. For those who had a sponsor attached to the coaching, they all said that they found the sponsor feedback as a tick box exercise. They didn't really see any value in that. And certainly there was no examples of closing the loop in terms of knowing what happened with that feedback, which was really interesting. Majority of participants reported that they had no idea how the coach would, or in fact did, use the feedback. They very rarely did a coach come back to them and say, oh, do you know what, I've thought about the feedback you give me and this is what I've done with it, or this is what I intend to do with it. So actually, that was something that coaches were aware of in the coaching sessions, and some also raised it as new awareness as well. varying recollections of naturally occurring feedback process, despite not contracted for or discussed. So what they were saying here was that a lot of coachees were saying, I don't really remember feedback taking place naturally in the sessions, but I'm sure it did. So it wasn't absolutely clear, crystal in their sort of memory bank, but they sort of had this assumption, well, I'm sure it did happen, but I can't remember it. So it wasn't actually being logged in their sort of long-term memory bank. What was really interesting as well was the levels of discomfort in providing feedback. And actually, quite often this was about positive feedback. And there was a real sense of allegiance, and they talked about agonizing over providing feedback. They wanted to be a good coachee. They were part of this this alliance, this relationship with the coach, and actually thought, I want it to be very authentic. I want it to be seen as sincere and genuine. And they actually do agonize over giving feedback to make sure it's helpful for the coach. They didn't want it to be too gushing. There was actually 2 out of the 7 who really talked about this. And really, there was quite a few thereafter as well who talked about the professionalism, that they were in this professional coaching discussion, but they felt that sometimes if the feedback was deemed too gushing, are they stepping out of the zone of professionalism? Are they stopping being professional by being too gushing? I'm not even going to try and sort of paraphrase it. They were their words, too gushing, and they really did have a challenge with that. Instances of agency where there was choice to not provide feedback was where if the coach wasn't asking for feedback, they didn't provide it. They felt very much positive about feeling listened to, being interested, that the coach was matching their energy, but still didn't give feedback. That coach never received that feedback. So this is where I'm really curious about the lost opportunities for our development as coaches, whether or not it's positive feedback or negative or neutral feedback. Frustrated with superficial coaching, i.e. being in front of the gates, but the silent disengagement, still turning up, but not providing feedback to say that actually they're not getting what they need out of it. Forcing depth in the relationship. Some coachees felt that the coach was forcing the relationship, could link into this lack of transparency in terms of what was actually happening, and also the contracting for working at depth. And actually, in this case, the coachee actually passed on the request to somebody else to give feedback that they didn't want to work with them anymore. So didn't actually give the coach any feedback, and doesn't know what feedback was given to that coach as well. In terms of the intuitive not knowing but just knowing section of the model, feedback not considered as professional. Again, that was new awareness for them, or intuition that it would be seen as too gushing. Perceived on the same level or being able to spar. They felt that they were sort of more able to provide feedback if they felt that they were on this real designed alliance, this same level as the coach, being able to, this is their words, being able to spar with them, that it sort of generated more conversational feedback in the moment, as opposed to being linked to a formal mechanism. Various perceptions of the motivation for feedback. Some real differences in terms of why they felt the coach wanted the feedback. A lot of people talked about, well, it's for testimonials, isn't it, to get new coaches? So really seeing the commercial value of the feedback as opposed to the developmental side of the feedback. Or they're using it for their own research or their own areas of interest, not for the development of the relationship or the development of themselves as individuals. So these were some of the gut instincts or intuitions that were coming through. In terms of the new awareness, a sense of surprise and shock. They hadn't thought about it until I'd asked them. They'd go, I've never really thought about feedback, but actually I'm quite shocked that I was never asked for it. That was very much new awareness. There was the holding up of hands from some coachees to take more responsibility with feedback, but that was new awareness that they weren't aware of at the time. This idea of professionalism impacting on the authenticity and not wanting to be too gushing. new tacit awareness and the value of retrospective feedback. They said, well, if I had my chance now, I'd give them this feedback because I've had more time to digest it, which raises the question, when do we ask for feedback? When would be helpful? And actually the interview style itself, which took on this social constructionist approach, very much about meaning making, exploration, curiosity on my part, was that actually they thought, do you know what, I found the way that we've had this discussion really helpful in terms of trying to make sense of the relationship. So I wonder if there's anything in there in terms of the style we adopt when we ask for feedback. And there's a quote there from participant 6 that I'll just share with you there. They talk about the language associated with feedback, this idea of being old school, and to what extent is it rigid. But the key thing that really got me was, I don't think anyone's ever come back and said, thanks for that, and by the way, this is what I've done with it, which is really, really interesting. Because, you know, it's like the you said we did. A couple more quotes here. Very much about taking responsibility, new awareness. Yeah, I haven't really thought about until you've asked me now. I should have taken more responsibility in this process. It was wrong to actually get somebody else to give the feedback. I didn't want to work with them again. This idea of overly professional. This was a very positive coaching relationship as well. Hugely positive. But at the feedback level, something happened. That coach didn't get the feedback. Again, here with another very, very positive account of this relationship. I think could be hugely valuable and like gold dust to coaches. And I think there's some lost feedback out there that could be really helpful for our development, not just as individuals, but as the sector as a whole. A little bit of links to literature. I'm linking actually into therapy and psychotherapy here, actually, because I think that's where there's more sort of links, actually. Continuous client feedback is reported by Brown and Jones. Difficulty sharing their perspectives. Difficult for clients to provide feedback if it's not part of the actual thread of the relationship. And talk about agency. So the feedback can come through different forms, but all down to the agency. They're the gatekeepers. And also, Henriksen, 2016 from Therapy, talks about retrospective views. And I wonder what opportunities there are there as well. So again, we've covered a lot there, but just before we do, and I'm not intending to be controversial here at all. I'm just thinking about, you know, it's an offer or an opportunity for us to sort of think about our own practice. But what does the Global Code of Ethics say? Well, it talks about feedback here under 4.8 in terms of our continuing professional development. The ICF actually Code of Ethics doesn't actually mention feedback, which is really interesting. If we look at our competency framework in EMCC, and we look at the coachees' feedback, what they'll receive through enabling insight and learning, it's really quite explicit about what we'll ask them to do with that feedback. But when we look at the evaluation section, which is about us receiving feedback or getting feedback, I'm sure it's implicit that we do more with that feedback. But is there opportunities to make that more explicit? And when we think about the quote from the coachee, what's the why of the feedback? What do you want the feed? Why do you want the feedback? What are you going to do with the feedback? Is there an opportunity for us to rethink what it actually means in our competency framework to engage in coachee feedback? That's not meant to be controversial, by the way. That's just meant to be an observation in service of, you know, us developing. So I'm going to pause there, and I think we're going to now have our second breakout. I'm just doing one check on the time. I think we've caught up quite well, actually, Nicola. I'm thinking about a 9-minute breakout, if that's all right. Shorter, but hopefully an opportunity to just capture some of the insights, the ideas, the intentions that are coming out of that second part.
Wonderful. Here we go. I think everybody's back now. Hello, everybody. Good to see you all back. As you're coming back, just spend a quiet minute again, just typing into the chat box here, just some things which have occurred to you while you've been away. Thank you for that, everybody. Just when people finish off their last sentences, hand you over to Steve. I've noticed a couple of things I've noticed there, Steve, around feedback being not necessarily just verbal, but physical, sometimes the negative space of not saying anything as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and great thoughts there. I suppose what didn't come up in the interviews was people, from a coachee's perspective, being aware of that. Obviously, from a coach's perspective, if we were to speak to the coaches, they would most likely, I would hope, say, I was picking up feedback in other ways. This is how I sort of interpreted through body language or the silent, non-verbal. So absolutely. But from a coachee's perspective, they certainly weren't bringing up, but they might not do either. They might obviously see, and that might be where we see feedback as this old school sort of formalized feedback of written feedback or, spoken feedback. So again, that might come into the contracting piece as well, in terms of how feedback will work in the relationship, both for them getting feedback and for you getting feedback as a coach. Penny, anything more to say on that? Obviously, your point there, raising that. So yeah, really valid point. Anything else to add?
Yeah, we had an interesting discussion about how, you've got all sorts of things going on in feedback, client preferences for written or verbal. You're picking up things, and you can be explicit about saying, I'm getting a hunch that we're not going as deep as you could do. Is that all right? There's all sorts of in the moment feedback, midway through formal feedback, informal feedback, very different types. And I think, your point is still valid, that we need to be explicit as to why we're asking whatever type of feedback. But there are very different client preferences out there, and they require different approaches, I think. So in your research, I'd be really interested to, my experience is that people are willing to say stuff very differently to what they're willing to write. So I'd just be really interested to know how, what the research tells us on that. But that's my intuition, perhaps, rather than anything.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I think what the really interesting point was that, very rarely did the participants recall actually the natural feedback. They're like, well, I'm sure it must have happened, but I can't recall it. So again, it's about, to what extent what's that say about the implicit, explicit in terms of how it might present itself in the relationship. But yeah, great point. And yeah, thank you for that. Ruth, just saying about the importance of the coach's reflective practice and supervision. Any sort of thoughts on that you'd be happy to share?
Yeah, sure. Just as that being part of the coach's process as well, so that when the coach is receiving feedback, that they're able to do something with it. There was something you said that stood out for me about the coachee didn't think the coach was going to do anything with their feedback, or didn't know that they'd done anything with it. So just the importance of feedback becoming part of your process as a practitioner, but also knowing that the coachee understands that that's part of the process as well. So the other thing I said was about normalizing feedback.
I saw that. Yeah,
part of our partnership, and being able to take the feedback to your supervision to reflect on what's come up for you, how you might show up differently. And there was a lovely thought that was shared in our group about how people communicate in different ways, across different clients. So just that being part of the coach's own development, really.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Ruth. Really, really helpful. So just before we sort of finish, you just one further slide to share with you. So what really came to mind for me was the idea of incorporating feedback what ifs into our contracting. So it's almost like, well, what if we get to a point here? How will we feed that back into the conversation? So what if this happens, or what if this happens? How might feedback back to me be helpful, etc.? What learnings can we take from the style of asking, this social constructionist approach of meaning making and a real exploration when we're asking for feedback? And that's something that I found myself applying sometime after now, maybe reaching out to people who I maybe coached maybe 2 or 3, 4 years ago, in terms of trying to really understand if there's anything still in there in terms of tacit awareness. Seeing evaluation as an emergent process, so seeing this as emergent rather than evaluation at the end of something. What opportunities exist to seek feedback sometime after, as I mentioned just then? How can we better understand the intuitive or the not known but just known world of the coachee? And how can we maximize access to feedback in support of our own development? So they're more sort of questions, really, that really do embrace that diversity, really, that we're all different. Our relationships are very different. Our preferences are different. But really just some sort of curious questions. And the last thing I'm just going to leave you with is just three possible readings that do link into feedback. So Eric Dehaan's Relational Coaching from 2008 very much does talk about coachees' perceptions of the relationship and intuitive accounts and how feedback can be gathered. We've got Tatiana Bachkarova's most recent edition of her developmental coaching from 2022, which again looks at intuition, but also suggests it from the coachee's perspective as well. And then we've got Jonathan Passmore's, and I'm pleased to say when it says a complete practitioner guide, I was just hoping that it did have a section on coachee feedback, and it does. So it is, and very much Jonathan Passmore and the authors within it actually talk about feedback from a coachee's perspective and link it to evaluation as well. So they're just 3 texts out there that will enable us to consider feedback from the coachee's perspective. But I'm just doing a time check now, and just to say, that's, I hope in some way that's been helpful, whether that's just insights, ideas, intentions, and what have you. Really would appreciate anything else you've got to add in the chat. That would be super helpful, because it's about then thinking, how do we make any findings relatable? How do we make them meaningful and useful in some way? But thanks very much for everybody for being here today and listening and taking part in the dialogue.
Can I jump in with a thank you to you as well, Stephen? It's been fascinating. I think probably everybody here has taken away something that they can pick up and run with straight away. But in terms of feedback as well, can I ask you as well, Steve, what are you taking from this?
I think what I'm taking from it is just probably the most important part of the research process, really, is in terms of how we then reach out to members in our community, our coaching community, to say, how do we just share our thinking? How do we share our knowledge, our thoughts, our ideas, our hunches, our hypotheses? How do we share that, and how do we sort of open up dialogues? And I think I've said that before. I think that's the most important thing for me, rather than scholarship or research or ideas being, I mentioned to you earlier, Nicola, I don't want to write a master's dissertation and then find it 20 years later in my loft or under the bed and go, oh, I wish I'd done something with that. It's not about being silent scholars, it's about sharing, and I think this is a great platform to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everybody for coming and engaging so brilliantly. Again, as always, it's always a lovely interjection in our week, I think, to come together in dialogue and really explore what's going on in the world of coaching and mentoring and supervision. And it's wonderful to see you all here. So thank you to all of you as well.